So good to be back with you. Let me begin by just reminding us where we've come so far. As you know, we're working through the grand narrative of Scripture, and we began by looking at the first movement, the movement that focuses on creation. And out of that movement, we talked about what it was that God intended for humanity, and then as a subset of that, what it was that God intended for business. And I suggested that on God's mission statement for business, really there are two purposes. Business exists to provide goods and services that would enable the community to flourish, and also that it exists to provide meaningful opportunities for individuals to express aspects of their God-given identity in creative work. And that's really the purpose of business. So then we moved on and took a look at the second movement, the fall. And in the fall, we were reminded that really one way to think of that is that Adam and Eve showed an unwillingness to live as they were designed, that is, to live as limited creatures. But instead, they wanted to be, in the words of the serpent, to be like God and without limits. And so they violated the limit that was at the very center of the garden, the linchpin limit, if you like, and therefore distorted the shalom of the garden in its entirety. And so really we talked about what it would look like for business to move back toward the shalom that God originally intended, and suggested that would mean that business would need to operate within some set of limits. And in particular, I suggested that as one way of describing the boundary conditions, we should think about the notion of sustainability. Not just environmental sustainability, but really sustainability across all the dimensions of a business. So service, purpose, sustainability, limits. And today, now, we're going to look at the third of these great movements, the movement that is dealing with redemption. Now, in some ways, redemption is the big story. In fact, if you look through Scripture as a whole, from the very end of the third chapter of Genesis, all the way through the 20th chapter of Revelation, it's still about redemption. It's about God wanting to get back what he had in the beginning. And in fact, you can think of the Old Testament as just one series of efforts by God to get back. Adam and Eve are removed from the garden, and immediately God gives them animal skins to protect them in this new environment they're heading out to. He sets a barrier so that they can't get back in and eat from the tree of life in a way that would permanently lock in their broken condition. He calls a special people, the nation of Israel, in part for Israel's own sake, but also in part that Israel would be a sign to the nations, so that the whole world would see this God that loved his people and be drawn back to him. God sets up mediating institutions. He gives kings. He sends prophets who go out to try to say, you're getting off course here, come back, come back. And when all of that doesn't work, God allows the nation of Israel to be taken off into exile. Not as a punishment primarily, but as a way of sort of stripping this people of all of their sort of earthly securities in a way that remind them how much they long for and want to return to God. And then he brings them back out of exile. So the whole Old Testament could be seen as these series of redemptive works. Near the end of Jesus' ministry, he tells this parable. He says there was an owner who had a vineyard, and he let it out to some tenants. And when the time came for rent to be collected, he sent a servant. And the tenants were supposed to pay rent to the servant because, among other things, that would reflect their right relationship. They were leasing the property from the owner. But they refused, and they beat the servant and sent him away. And the owner sent another servant, and they treated this one shamefully. And a third servant, this one they killed. And the owner says, what do I do? How do I reestablish the right relationship? He says, I've got an idea. I'll send my son. Surely they'll respect my son. And so the son is sent, and of course you know how the parable ends. The tenants see the son and they say, look, it's the heir. If we kill the heir, we can have it. We will be the owners. Now Jesus tells this parable, I think, to describe his role in God's big plan of redemption. God in the Old Testament sent one servant after another servant to try to get back this right relationship. And when none of that worked, he said, I will send my son. Surely they will respect my son. And so Jesus saw his own ministry as essentially the culminating act in God's redemptive work through the Old Testament. And of course, Jesus' own ministry was clearly a ministry of redemption, of reconciliation. In fact, At the very beginning of his ministry, he goes into the synagogue in Nazareth. This is described in the 4th chapter of Luke, and he picks up the scroll from Isaiah, and he reads what is really his personal mission statement. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." I mean, you think every one of those is a redemptive thing, to give sight back to those who are blind, to those who are in prison, to let them go, those who are suffering from injustice, to bring justice back to them, to end the oppression. And then really right at the end of that, this notion of proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor is probably a reference to the Old Testament concept of Jubilee. There was this notion that there would be a Jubilee year every 50 years. And in Jubilee, all the slaves would be freed, all debts would be canceled, and perhaps most profoundly, all of the land that would have been bought and sold during the prior 50 years would be returned to the initial families that owned it. Everything would be put back. And so there is this throughout this ministry of putting things back right. And of course, Jesus' ministry from there really exhibits that. He casts out demons. He heals the sick. He teaches about this notion of reconciling and redemption. One of the interesting things is that the Pharisees and the scribes are always trying to position Jesus as a judge. You shouldn't eat with those people, and surely if Jesus was who he said he was, he would know that these women were bad and he shouldn't be with them. But Jesus always refuses that designation, and he says, look, I didn't come to be a judge, I came to be a doctor. I had to go to the people that were sick in order to heal them. I came to be a shepherd. I need to go to the sheep that were lost in order to bring them back. His whole life was about redemption. And if his life is the culmination of God's work all through the Old Testament, then his death and resurrection is the culmination of his life. Because at his death, at the cross, and in the subsequent resurrection, really fully and finally, the curse is defeated. The curse is reversed. Sin is defeated. Jesus hanging on the cross shouts out, "It is finished." And really that marks the end. That marks the completion of this work of redemption. So, what does this have to tell us about business? Well, for one thing, it reminds us that God has not given up on his plan. Now, we developed a set of sort of purpose statements coming out of Genesis. And it would be fair to ask, given that those were developed before the fall, maybe in light of the fall, God had another plan. He changed his mind. And I sometimes like to think of it as with kind of a metaphor this way. Imagine that instead of creating all of creation, what God created was a sailboat. And he said, look, here's my plan. My plan is that you and I, working together, are going to sail this boat to Hawaii. And yes, you've got work to do. You've got to raise and lower the sails. You've got to plot a course. You've got to steer the boat. But I've got work to do too, because I'm going to be the wind. And I'm going to fill the sail. And together, we're going to go to Hawaii. So imagine then that you go to the marina. That, by the way, is the creation mandate. Now let's go to the marina and we discover that the boat is trashed. The sail is ripped. The instrument panel is all smashed. There's a hole in the hull. That's the fall. The question that we're asking is whether God says now, gee, in light of the condition of this boat, maybe we ought to just sail to some nearby island. Maybe we ought to give up on Hawaii. And the reality is that this whole theme of redemption reminds us that that is not true. That God has no plan B. That from beginning to end, God is about getting back what he originally intended in the beginning. Even the word redeem means to buy or take back. The word salvation in Greek is literally translated to get healthy, to recover from a sickness, to get back. One theologian, Albert Walters, puts it this way. He says, acknowledging this scriptural emphasis, theologians have sometimes spoken of salvation as recreation, not to imply that God scratches his earlier creation and in Jesus Christ makes a new one, but rather to suggest that he hangs on to his fallen original creation and salvages it. He refuses to abandon the work of his hands. In fact, he sacrifices his own son to save his original project. Humankind, which has botched its original mandate, and the whole creation along with it, is given another chance in Christ. We are reinstated as God's managers on earth. The original good creation is to be restored. So what does this have to say about business? Well, for one thing, it reminds us then, or confirms for us, that those purpose statements that we developed out of the creation account remain true. Still, business exists to serve. It still exists to serve through the products it delivers and through the jobs it creates. Still the same purpose. But one thing has changed. Now the very nature of the work that is to be done has changed. If you think about it, in the garden, in God's original plan, work was always, in a sense, additive, forward-moving, kind of bringing new things out. We didn't have to talk about reconciliation or redemption or healing or justice in the garden because nothing was broken, nothing was lost, nothing was sick. There was no injustice. These are all concepts that come after the fall. So there was work that we call the creation mandate that was this forward-looking work. But now, as a result of the fall, business also has an opportunity to participate in the work of redemption. Going back to my sailboat little metaphor, before we can sail, and we still have to do all the things, raise and lower the sails and steer the boat and all that stuff. Before we can do that, though, we have to engage in some repair work. And so business now is engaged in doing some new work. It's all to the same purpose, but it has both forward-looking work and redemptive reconciling work. So examples might be business could get involved in developing products that would clean up toxic dumps or take care of polluted waterways. It could provide internet access to people who've been cut off and therefore economically oppressed. It could provide vaccines that would cure diseases that are ravaging whole continents. It could provide beautiful urban designs to deal with blighted neighborhoods. These are all acts in which business is doing a restoring, redemptive work in addition to its creative, flourishing forward work. And so that's one implication, it seems to me, we should take away from this. But there's another one. And that is this. I said a minute ago that Jesus is hanging on the cross and he shouts out, "It's finished," and sin is defeated and the curse is reversed. But really, if we think about our own lives and the world we live in, it doesn't feel that way very often. In fact, an awful lot of the time, it feels to us like we're in a very broken world and things aren't working the way they're supposed to. And the truth of the matter is that we live in this weird in-between place. On the one hand, we live this side of the resurrection, but yet we still anticipate Jesus coming again for this final consummation. We live in this in-between place, a place I sometimes call the messy middle. Theologians sometimes refer to this as the already not yet. The kingdom is already here, but not yet in its fullest sense. One English writer described it a little bit like what it was like when the Allies were successful in establishing a beachhead at Normandy on D-Day. He said once that beachhead was established, the ultimate outcome of the war was never in doubt. It was clear from that moment on that the Nazis would be defeated. But if you happened to be living in occupied France at the time, it didn't feel like the Nazis had been defeated. There was a kind of an unfolding of the victory that still needed to take place, and that remains true. We are living in weird space. We live in between, on the one hand, this resurrection of Jesus, and we await still his coming again, this final consummation. And in the in-between time, there's this kind of messy middle. So what are the implications of living in this messy middle for us? Well, put really simply, it seems to me that for all of what we've talked about, how God intends business to be run for these particular purposes, and how he intends for it to respect the sidebars of sustainability, and that is truly what God calls us as people in business to aspire to. Because we're in this broken world, at times it seems like we just can't do it. That is, we can't live up to the fullness of the call that God might give us. There are times, it seems, when business couldn't stop production of a product that's proving harmful to society and still at the same time provide a reasonable return to its investors. There are times when a business can't rejigger its manufacturing process in a way that would protect the environment, but at the same time not end up costing a lot of jobs. There are times when it's just not possible to pay a livable wage and return a reasonable risk-adjusted rate of return to shareholders. In other words, it seems like because of the brokenness of the world we live in, even though these are truly what God calls us to, and even if our hearts were totally pure and right, there are times when it seems like we can't fully do what God calls us to. Now, if that's true, it seems to me there are many implications, and I actually want to talk about this at some greater length in one of the later video clips. But let me, for our purposes, leave you with two thoughts here. They really mark, in a sense, the extremes of reactions that we might have to this sense of being caught in this tension. On the one hand, and this I see with some frequency, we could, in effect, deny the tension. I sometimes have asked Christians in business, I've said, how many times, how often do you experience the tug of what you think God is calling you to, pulling in a direction that's different from the choice that would be most profitable? And amazingly to me, most of the time, Christians in business say, oh, I've never experienced that, or once in a long while do I experience something like that. What I think is going on there is what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. That means it's so hard to stand in places where you feel called to do something that you can't quite bring yourself to be able to do, that rather than live in that tension, you kind of find a way to make it go away psychologically. And so rather than live in that tension, we diminish it. We just sort of diminish what God calls us, and we shrink God's sense of what business people are called to. Now it's all just about being honest and being kind, and we don't think about purpose and sustainability because it's easier that way. We really dare not do that. We need to stay alert to the fullness of what God is calling us to, even when it seems almost impossible to deliver. But there is another danger in this approach, and that is we see the tension, we feel the tension all the time, and we just say, oh, it's a tension. There's nothing I can really do about it, so I just choose A. I choose living wages. I choose better pollution controls. I choose more returns to shareholders. I just choose something. And we dare not do that either. You see, as Christians, we're called to live in this place of tension and to hold on for as long as we can in search of another way, of a third alternative. Some way that would both fit within the forces of the marketplace and at the same time honor all that God is calling us to do. It may not be that we will always be able to find that third way. It may be that the world is broken to the point that there may be no third way, but we dare not come to that conclusion too quickly. We have to press into that and hold on to it for as long as we can and give up only at the absolute last minute. So this is what I think we take away from redemption, that God is in the business of getting back what he had in mind from the beginning. It reaffirms the purpose of business. The purpose of business is to serve through goods and services and meaningful and creative work. That businesses need to be run in ways that are sustainable. That business participates in both creative, forward-looking work and redeeming, reconciling work. And that because we live in this messy middle, the already not yet world, we live often in places of tension, and we dare not make the tension just go away, and we dare not give up on the tension, but we need to live creatively into the tension for as long and as hard as we can. Thanks.